Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Adult CLL Chapter event brought to you by the HealthTree Community for CLL Program. My name is Megan Heaps, and I am the CLL Program Manager at HealthTree Foundation. Very grateful to have each of you here today and for your support in building the CLL community. I'd like to let you know that today's session will be recorded, and the recording, along with any resources we discussed today, will be sent via email to all registrants within 48 hours after the event has concluded. We'll start with a brief Zoom meeting tutorial for those who are new to the platform. We would love for all of you to turn on and keep your cameras on if you feel comfortable. Doing so helps us to create a stronger sense of community. You can see on the slide how to turn on your camera. At the bottom of the screen, you should see the microphone and camera buttons. You can click the video icon that says Start Video in order to turn your camera on. With that being said, if you're not comfortable being recorded, you're not required to keep your camera on. Your microphone should currently be off and will be kept off by our team throughout the presentation. During the group discussion, you're welcome to unmute yourself once you are called upon. If you have any questions or comments for us or for our speaker throughout their presentation, please click the chat icon and type them in the chat box. If you're using a mobile device or a tablet, click the three-dot icon that says More and then Chat in order to access the chat box. And lastly, if you would prefer to verbally ask a question or make a comment directly to our speaker during the discussion time at the end, we encourage you to do so. If you're using a laptop or desktop computer, click Reactions near the bottom of your screen and then click Raise Hand. If you're using a mobile device or tablet, you can click the three horizontal dots that say More, and then click the Raise Hand button. Now let's get started with today's event. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors who make events like this possible, AbbVie and Genentech. The topic of our event today is How Can CLL Clinical Trials Help Me? Here is the agenda. For today, I will introduce our speaker, Dr. Danielle Brander. Dr. Brander will then spend the next few minutes giving us her presentation. After the presentation, we'll open it up for your questions and comments. So let me take a moment to introduce our speaker, Dr. Danielle M. Brander. Dr. Brander completed her medical degree, internal medicine residency training, and fellowship in hematology oncology at Duke University and Duke University Health System. Her clinical and research focus is in the care of patients with CLL and SLL, and she directs the CLL and Lymphoma Clinical Research Program within the Duke Cancer Institute. Dr. Brander has served as site PI for diverse clinical trials of targeted therapeutics for CLL and SLL and other B-cell malignancies. She collaborates on initiatives in chronic care cancer with the DCI Onc Primary Care and is involved in the National Alliance Cooperative Group in clinical trials, serving as a leukemia committee member and CLL Evolve trial champion. She is dedicated to mentoring and medical education activities, as well as patient and caregiver educational initiatives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brander.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the kind both invitation and introduction today. Our goal today really is a community discussion as much more so than a formalized presentation on this topic, and certainly want to make sure that we have sufficient time at the end for any and all questions that we can get to during this hour that we have together. As was introduced, I have been at Duke for a number of years, and in my current role, direct our CLL and lymphoma clinical trials. I lead some of those as site PI or principal investigator myself, and others that we're collaborating in. So really, what I wanted to just start with is discussing a lot of background of clinical trials, how they may be beneficial, or at least an understanding of their role in helping patients with CLL and SLL. And I'll approach this presentation really with what has come to me over the years in patient questions. So patient and caregiver questions have significantly informed the way that I mention and go over clinical trials for my own patients. And so again, I encourage you to be thinking of these questions for the second half of our hour together, as we all learn as much from you and sharing your questions and informing how we then discuss this with other patients. Of course, at the end of the day, this hour hopefully will give an overview of how they may be beneficial to you or someone you're help care for. Of course, ultimately, whether to explore a clinical trial or not, or whether you qualify for one, would come down to an individual discussion with you and your physician and other treating team. So with that, I just want to go over some general things about clinical trials, not necessarily unique for helping patients with CLL, but just understanding what is a clinical trial and why are they important. So taking really a step back, clinical trial, oftentimes you'll hear as also as clinical research, although those are different. In a clinical trial, we often, but not always, think of patients who are receiving a treatment that's either not approved for a given reason. For example, in this case, for patients with CLL, but might be approved in other for patients with other malignancies. Or sometimes clinical trials are to look at new drug combinations, meaning an individual drug or all the individual drugs being used for treatment may be approved individually, but it's important to understand if that combination is both safe and potentially beneficial for patients. What I want to just start out with in terms of other concepts regarding clinical trials is, while most often we think of them in terms of drugs or cancer treatments, there are important clinical trials or opportunities to be part of trials that are looking at maybe not direct therapeutic intervention or drug treatment interventions. That is, perhaps it's looking to study or research or understand what other concurrent things can be done to improve the treatment or improve tolerability. So just keeping that in mind as you're meeting with your oncologist and an oncology team, that if being part of clinical trials or clinical research is important to you, there may be ways to do that that are beyond taking a drug or taking a treatment itself. In terms of the type of clinical trials, and again, this is coming from what patients have asked me or inquired with me or inquired for clarification over the years. There, in addition to whether we talk about drug interventions versus other clinical research, there's different phases of clinical trials for drug interventions. For example, a phase 1 study, often, and the goals of each of these are different, is really first and foremost looking at a drug or a medication initially and determining if it is safe to move forward. Now, of course, all phases of trials, first and foremost, want to look and still gather information on safety, but particularly in a phase 1 study, there's often additional measures about safety, meaning the intervention is looking to look at what dose is well tolerated or what regimen. So often patients are only a few patients at a time are receiving the treatment, and only a few patients if it's what's called a dose escalation study. That means you're looking at each individual drug dosage and making sure that is safe after a certain period of time before additional patients are being considered and enrolled into that clinical trial for CLL or SLL. In a phase 2 study, This is really, again, always still looking at safety, but looking at growing even more from safety and finding the dose to expanding and starting to understand more information about some other aspects, including how well it works and how well it works in responses, or how well it works in improving symptoms if that's the goal. In phase 3 studies, typically the goal of a phase 3 study is through comparison to see how it works compared to other effective treatments. And the reason that this is important is because comparing results between trials is difficult, because depending on when it was started, the trial is started, patients may have had different prior treatment exposures. The eligibility, which we'll talk about in a minute what that means, may be different for trials. So you really can't compare one trial truly to another in terms of results. So often a phase 3 study goal really is for that comparison within the same group of eligible patients to make a determination of how safe and effective a treatment is. And often those phase 3 studies ultimately is what is being looked at before a medication or a drug is approved. Now, again, these different phases of studies may be a generalization. It's not true in every case. And there's also phase 4 studies, actually, which tend to be for after medication might be approved to continue the research and understand maybe some post-approval information about what patients are experiencing, or asking a question that really can only be answered through additional studies. Now, what is the benefit of participating in clinical trials, or as an individual, what is the potential benefit? Well, as we just mentioned and talked about in terms of drug or therapeutic clinical trials, the hope or goal, especially as I sit down with an individual patient, is to think of potentially participating if eligible. If that treatment, or in the case of randomized trials where it's the novel treatment versus maybe a standard treatment, the goal hopefully is for patients always to, in addition to the experience, potentially either have a novel combination of drugs or have a novel way that the medication is being given. In some cases, especially in early phase studies, where the drug may not be approved, the clinical trial may be the only access to novel or promising therapies. And certainly fortunate now for some of the treatments that are approved for patients with CLL or SLL, non-traditional chemo treatments. Most of those in recent years only became to be approved and be available for more patients because of the clinical trials that led to their approval. But at an individual level, to determine if a trial is right for you, you and your physician need to sit down, of course, and carefully consider how it may be beneficial for you. As I mentioned, in some cases, perhaps the available options each have of treatment, each have their own limitations, and clinical trials may provide access or a benefit that wouldn't be available outside of clinical trials. I mentioned before, though, in terms of determining if a clinical trial is right for you, that this can be very variable depending on the type of study, as well as for patients, everything else about your medical history, meaning on an individual basis, it's okay if the clinical trial isn't the right one for you. That's an individual decision both for you and for your treating physician to make. Sometimes clinical trials may provide other benefit beyond the actual medication if it's a drug intervention trial itself, for example. And that would be based on how the trial itself is set up and information you could ask the treating team. For example, in some cases, a clinical trial that requires additional visits may have support, financial support for patients to be able to travel and complete those visits. But again, that's based on an individual trial and something you would have to talk to the treating physician or the overall lead of the clinical trial. In terms of eligibility for clinical trials, there are what are called inclusion and exclusion criteria for every clinical trial. And this really is standardized in terms of having for all trials, because the goal is to understand what patients are safe to be on the clinical trials, at least as a initial first step. Of course, safety is continued to be followed through clinical trials. It also helps to interpret clinical trial results, right? Because if patients with certain conditions aren't allowed on some studies or aren't allowed on others, that may influence the way that we interpret or look at the results. Or for medications that are approved, need to understand if those patients with those conditions were included in clinical trials. I also mention it because if you're interested in clinical trials and there are options available, it may be possible that you don't qualify even at first glance for some of the clinical trials because of these inclusion and exclusion criteria. And that, again, may vary from trial to trial or place to place, and something important to talk about. In addition to, providing access to the medications or novel treatment approaches, as I mentioned, there may be other benefits to participating in clinical trials. And ultimately, I think even for approved medications, sometimes the reason that they're being studied is to ask new or important different questions that may inform future research or options for patients. How to become involved in clinical trials or understand where clinical trials are being conducted. Again, first, you can talk with your individual oncology or medical team. Or now there are several important sites online, if it's something you're interested in, to understand what clinical trials are occurring across the country. One of those websites is called clinicaltrials.gov. That is all clinical trials with investigative agents or devices have to be listed on the clinicaltrials.gov website and periodically updated to include where those clinical trials are being conducted, the goals of the trials, and what patients are included. There are also updates as the trial is being conducted. Now, that website is a great central way where all trials are listed, but can have its own, I won't say difficulties, but its own nuances into navigating that website. And there are keys, and other organizations have provide guidelines to trying to use and interpret the information that's on clinicaltrials.gov. There are also other important organization partners that the goal is to help for those that are interested understand what trials and where those trials are for interested patients and their caregivers. For example, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, or LLS. Some of these not only involve resources posted to online, but navigators to really try to help understand, so that the burden not on you as an individual, try to understand what you are looking for, where things are in terms of, have you had treatment yet? Have you not had treatment yet? Are there clinical trials, not just looking at drug treatment options, and really understanding and partnering and matching with places that may have that kind of clinical trial. Similarly, other CLL-focused resources such as the CLL Society, Leukemia or Lymphoma Research Foundation, my apologies, as well as individual academic institutions, all list online the general overviews of what clinical trials may be available for you at a given site. Let's see. I want to mention again that that not all trials are drug therapeutics. So either if your CLL doesn't yet need treated or has been treated and is in a response or remission, but you're interested in participating in clinical research or trials, please consider that there are other non-drug intervention trials as well. Just looking at my notes for some of the other commonly asked questions that I receive for patients, one of which is, are there placebos on cancer or oncology clinical trials? In other words, for a given clinical trial, will you receive an inactive, not a medication, but a placebo as part of the treatment? The short answer is that there are sometimes clinical trials that involve placebos, but this is often in combination with other treatments, and certainly many, if not overwhelming majority, do not involve the use of a placebo. If it is a clinical trial that at any point potentially involves a placebo, again, either in combination with other agents or for a specific reason, that's something that you would know as you're hearing more about the clinical trial. For example, if the clinical trial doesn't involve placebo at all, which again is the majority of those trials, you would know that before starting on the trial. It's certainly not as many think of research is, which is that there's always a placebo part of the trial. That certainly is not true. What is provided by a clinical trial? Well, if it involves an investigational medication or agent or device, then that is provided if it's investigational and not approved. What else is provided would depend on the individual trial, but in some cases, as I mentioned, may be inclusive to other things that are needed to participate in the trial, such as financial support or reimbursement support, depending on the visits and the nature of that. That is also, though, very standardized, and I may not be using the correct terminology there, meaning that would be part of the explanation of the trial and the consenting to the trial to understand what is and what isn't or can be provided. Again, that's all very much regulated by the trial as well as the individual institution. What are my obligations if I do join a clinical trial? Well, when I meet with patients, again, the goal of an individual offering or talking about a trial for an individual patient is the hope that it will benefit that individual. We don't know if it will. It might offer something new that may or may not be better. We try as best we can, both in the consent as well as counseling a patient, to explain all the potential risks. But if at any point in meeting with a patient, if a patient themselves or we determine that it's no longer the best option, whether it's a right for you as an individual patient, certainly at any time patients have the right without having to be a specific reason to withdraw consent or come off of the study. That's an important conversation with, of course, your medical team, so that important next steps can be planned ahead for. In other words, I think the goal is all along to make sure that it is the right path forward for you as an individual. The other things, of course, would be if the overall number of visits or side effects or whatever else comes up as part of the clinical trial is not right for you, then that's all, considered of whether to continue on the clinical trial. What information is important to know about an individual clinical trial? What should I know or what should I ask before starting on a treatment? Well, I think of this as different steps. First and foremost, if we're talking more about the clinical trials of drug interventions or drugs as treatment, I think the very first initial conversation or step, for example, if it's time for first treatment or for relapse treatment, is understanding what would be the options outside of clinical trials. Why might those standard options not or what could maybe be improved upon by those standard options for you as an individual? What are the requirements of the clinical trial? And all of those, both what the standard treatment is, of course, anything known about the side effects of the treatments, as well as the number of visits or other requirements of the study, in addition to being introduced to you by your oncology team, should all be part of the informed consent process. What informed consent is, as some might have experienced outside of oncology clinical research, is really providing consent or permission and understanding what you're providing it on. In the context of clinical trials in oncology, sometimes these informed consent documents can be very lengthy, but the forms themselves are also approved by the individual institution's review board, which the goal is for the safety and protection of all patients that receive treatment or participate in the research clinical trials. So those documents are not intended or certainly would be against the intent of them to be written or in a way that's not understandable for patients. However, despite sometimes intentions, if either your own understanding or the way something is written or disclosed, there's at any point any questions on that, that's all part of the meeting before signing informed consent, and any study-related procedures can begin. Patients also have a right and to be provided with that informed consent document, which again goes over the visits, what's required at the visits, goes over the treatment itself, known side effects, the frequency of the known side effects, and also should always provide contact information, not just for the study team, but as an institution as a whole, if any medical related questions or side effects come up. So when patients say, what should I know before starting? I think summary of understanding what the options are outside of clinical trials, anticipating that informed consent day and time ahead of that to review and answer questions, and can always go back to the same. Similarly, I'll just mention in terms of informed consent, I think some patients understand that happens at the start before any research trials or treatments start, but it actually happens along the way too. We call it, reconsenting. So there are significant updates to the study itself, anything known new about the medications themselves, or any other differences in the trial, then the consent process starts or occurs again throughout the trial. Just to, kind of summarize, as well as give some example of some clinical trials we've had at Duke University and the Duke Cancer Institute. Our goal of offering or having available clinical trials at the end of the day is really, while there are multiple novel treatments now available for patients with CLL, SLL, or related cancers. I think many of us also recognize that there's ways to improve upon that, certainly for individual patients and hopefully as a path forward for all patients with CLL or SLL. And so the hope or the goal is to continue to offer and have available clinical trials for patients, although it may not be for every patient at every point in time. The second summary point I'll just make, again, is a lot of this conversation or what we think about is in terms of drug or typical intervention clinical trials. But our hope in clinical research and trials moving forward is to continue to offer and think beyond the drugs themselves and other ways that we can hopefully improve upon the lives of patients with CLL or SLL. One example of these kind of studies at Duke has been in partnership with one of my colleagues, Dr. Andrea Sittlinger, who has led research in the past, not looking at the role of fitness and exercise for patients with CLL, SLL that may or may not be on therapy. Others examples of non-drug typical interventional trials has been our partnership with Onco Primary Care at Duke and looking in research of improving that, for example, looking at hypertension management for patients on certain treatments that may raise blood pressure and how we partner with primary care and others for that management, as well as a study looking at bone health for patients with CLL or SLL, which is not standardized or certainly not as much known about as we do with some other malignancies. Examples of clinical trials over the years for patients with CLL or SLL has been everything from phase 1 studies looking at targeted drugs. So one of the classes of drugs that has been very helpful for patients with CLL or SLL has been targeting BTK, either as inhibitors, covalent inhibitors, and non-covalent inhibitors, as well as now we have a BTK degrader clinical trial in phase 1. We've had many phase 2 studies, including not just BTK inhibitors, either alone or in combination. And those classical BTK inhibitors we've had have been ibrutinib, acalabrutinib, zanubrutinib clinical trials with or without combination, as well as venetoclax, which is a different category of what we call anti-apoptotic inhibitors. And again, these have been both in early phase, and sometimes early phase studies aren't just including for CLL, but other lymphomas. Phase 2 specifically to CLL, and then we've had some phase 3 studies as well. We've also had beyond the pathway or the apoptotic inhibitors, had the clinical trial looking at CAR T for patients with CLL and SLL. And many of these trials for patients may be ongoing, meaning we're continuing the research and patients are receiving treatment, but may not be open for new enrollment. But again, these are listed, available listed both at Duke as well as the national websites that I mentioned earlier. So that we have enough time certainly for questions, I want to wrap up and conclude the portion of me talking so that we can move to all your questions. But again, I just want to say thank you and my appreciation both for being included in this discussion, but also I want to thank on behalf of everyone for all our patients and their caregivers who've given time, effort, energy, and important feedback to us by participating in clinical trials. And again, I appreciate everyone's time on this call today as well to learn about clinical trials and how they may benefit you or someone you help care for. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brander, for that very informative presentation. That was very helpful. And so now we will move to the discussion part of today's event. As a reminder to everyone, you can ask a question or make a comment by typing it in the chat box or by raising your hand if you'd like to speak. If you do raise your hand once you're called on, go ahead and then unmute yourself. So Dr. Brander, as the questions come in, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, so you stated like in the case of the BTK degrader trial or any trial at Duke Cancer Institute, as patients are going over the consent form and becoming aware of potential side effects, does the principal investigator or the nurses on the team also state, yes, these side effects may happen, but this is how, like, these are potential side effect management solutions? Or is that not typically discussed and patients find out after the fact of, well, I guess my platelets dropped and now we're in the moment and you'll tell me how to handle that. What does the patient education kind of look like for side effect management?
Yeah, that excellent question. So it's first of all, informed consents. The goal is to provide the side effects, but also the as best estimate from prior trials or what's known in other cancers, the likelihood of that side effect. In other words, I think it's very important to know, for example, common side effects because they're common and you know to expect them. But something may be very uncommon, but very serious. And then the goal there is to, of course, be informed and unaware so that you can notify your team or get emergency care if that develops. But I find the most helpful informed consents both in going over with patients as well as kind of standardizing it is to understand that list of side effects, how likely it is, to occur. And so different trials or consents might list it by percentage or a number of patients per 100 that happen. In terms of the management of the side effect, it guess depends on what type of side effect it is and if it's unique to the drug. For example, nausea may be a common side effect of all treatments, and so the management of anti-nausea medicines might be something common regardless of the type of treatment, and that typically we don't go over necessarily individually, or patients at risk for infection, then the treatment really is going to be against the infection itself. But I'm glad you asked the question because certainly for some of the newer treatments, for example, immune or cellular therapies, there may be specific treatments for the side effect. For example, with CAR T or cellular therapy, people can, as their body is reacting to the treatment itself, have what's called cytokine release. And that involves different medications and management that may be very different than kind of the common side effect management. So we try to go over those more unique, or not just we, but the consent should help, provide guidance for those type of side effects. But I think a general thing to understand is that on clinical trials, there is some management that has to be standardized. And what I mean by that is when people have a side effect, depending on the severity and if it's felt to be likely or unlikely related to the treatment, the protocol should be clear about how that's managed. For people not getting treated on the trial, there may be nuances where in some cases you continue the medication for a level of a side effect. Other people might discontinue it, but on a clinical trial, it really should be standardized. And so people might be feeling okay and they go in and their blood counts are very low. And the trial, for safety reasons, has already determined that it's beyond the individual, treating team to decide whether patients have to temporarily stop the medicine, for example. So I think that, to answer your question, is important. Understand the likelihood, the severity, and understand that in some cases, what happens next, especially with the treatment itself, may be determined, within the protocol and beyond just what your treating physician might say about the medicine.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for elaborating on that. That does answer my question.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have a couple raised hands. Valeria was first, and then we'll go Alberto and Paula. All right, so Valeria, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Well, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about non-drug interventions in clinical trials.
Yeah, great question. So there can be clinical trials that involve, I gave the example, it's not open currently, but my colleague who had a clinical trial looking at the role of exercise intervention for patients with CLL or SLO. And there, it wasn't about taking a drug or a medication to treat the CLL or even CLL that needed treatment at the time, but the non-drug intervention was looking at potential benefits, risks, et cetera, of doing that individualized exercise activity. There may be some places too that have done clinical trials looking at non-traditional medications, for example, the role of certain supplements. We don't have any examples of those trials right now, but I think there is or there have been, studies done, and so an individual place may have research being done that's not just about treating the CLL directly with either research drugs or approved drugs and combinations. I think for patients with CLL or SLL, looking for those trials or understanding if they or clinical research exist is important because some patients may go a while before their CLL meets traditional treatment indications, but there might be other studies or research that can be or that people can participate in. At a smaller individual but important level, there's also sometimes research done about what symptoms patients have related to their CLL or SLL, and the opportunity if on a research study to, for example, donate blood, so that researchers doing studies and understanding CLL are studying that for unique to what CLL cells experience. So I just wanted to go over that because I think understandably sometimes we only think of clinical trials about medications or drugs, but there are other opportunities out there. There's also sometimes for an approved drug studies that look at patient-reported side effects, or sometimes you'll hear patient-reported outcomes, what symptoms you're experiencing on or off treatment. And the goal is to collect, not just through trial as adverse events, but really collect additional information from patients themselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Valeria, and thank you, Dr. Brander, for your insight. Okay, next question we have is Alberto. I apologize. Alberto, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. The question for Dr. Brander would be, what are the current challenges in developing targeted therapies for CLL?
Yeah, great question. So some of the I guess, challenges or unmet. So I guess I think of it two ways. I want to make sure I understand your question. One of the challenges, I guess, in the trial themselves is how do we make targeted treatments better from what is currently available? In other words, how do we know from one study, just because a new drug, say as a BTK inhibitor, comes out and we hope for it to be, newer, better, how do we design the trial really to answer that question? If a new drug is being developed or comes out, how do we compare that without in the right way? Because I mentioned at the start of this, we have to be very cautious in comparing trials because the patients included in different trials are different. But how do we, both encourage that development, but prevent the situation of it's just not feasible to do all the comparisons? So if medication, T come out, how do I know it's better than C without doing a trial that compares C and T, which is probably in many cases not possible to do all of those comparisons. So I would say one of the difficulties is how do we do this in a feasible way. Another that is, beyond CLL, but I think people are trying to be thoughtful about nationally with initiatives is how do we, for promising unmet need areas, how do we safely speed up development of medications to availability? Because historically it was both a lot of time as well as costly to take, medications through all the development steps. And like I said, this is beyond just trials for CLL or SLL. People nationally are trying to be thoughtful about that. Another, I think, really big important difficulty we need to recognize is how do we make clinical trials more accessible for more patients, and how do we make sure that the results we get from clinical trials include patients so that we can apply those results to all the patients that we're seeing. While I think it's an important question for an individual to ask, how can the trial support me to participate? I'll be honest, the reality sometimes of clinical trials is it can be more visits, or the times have to be different, and that's just not feasible for some people. So I think at the end of the day, if we really want to know and understand how new treatments can benefit everyone, then we have to make sure that we're designing trials or having trials that are inclusive of patients. In terms of challenges from an unmet needs standpoint, meaning, we have clinical trials and drugs approved now, but what are the challenges not being reached? I'd say for patients with CLL or SLL, for patients particularly after they've had, right now we defined as BTK inhibitor and BCL2, which right now the only BCL2 inhibitor is venetoclax, have had exposures or especially progression of the CLL, SLL after those treatments. There's, as I mentioned, promising agents being developed, and recently there was a non-covalent BTK inhibitor, pirtobrutinib, available. There's, CAR T that's become available in lots of clinical trials. But because BTK and BCL2 inhibitors are two of the most, upfront or in the first relapse setting, most effective for patients that those treatments have failed them or disease has progressed, that's still an area of unmet need. And for cellular or immunotherapies in CLL, I think the challenge there is understanding, who can benefit, when they should receive and can benefit, what are ways we can improve response rates, because some patients can have really lasting responses, and how do we improve on some of the side effects. Did that answer your questions?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you again, Dr. Brander. Okay, we have another question, right? Paula, go ahead and ask your question, Paula.
Hi, Dr. Brander. My question is, if I enroll in a clinical trial, will I be informed of any new findings during the study?
Yes, so great question. So in my overview, I mentioned the informed consent or consent. The goal of it is not just to be provided at the start, but to be provided when there are substantial updates that should be delivered to all patients. Now, those updates can include everything from updates on the side effect of the drugs that's reached a substantial either number or unexpected side effects that's important for all patients to be available or aware of. It should also be inclusive of other treatments are becoming or treatment options becoming approved, though that's not maybe necessarily the study treatment itself update. I think it's an update in terms of understanding and balancing the risks and if that treatment is right for you. So that, reconsent process or new updated consents, especially in the case of CLL or SLL, where participating in a trial might be ongoing for years, you might expect to have several new or reconsents during the course of that study. Similarly, if it's going to be a change not to the medication itself, but for example, the visits or the follow-up or anything else about participating and agreeing to participate in the study, then that is part of the reconsent process as well. That's, I guess, different than a real-time necessarily trial study updates, if that makes sense. Data or information from all patients is coming in at different rates. So it's different than, for example, we're not really provided, say, a report of the study updates, but really on those areas that I was mentioning that may better inform or update your informed consent to remain on the study. Lastly, some of the things I talked about the different websites or resources that can list where clinical trials are done. Some of those same organizations also help interpret when a trial, for example, does provide updates. This can happen not at an individual level, but a trial might present results at a planned interim analysis, for example. The efficacy or how well a trial works or certain other data points, it wouldn't be appropriate to provide as everything keeps coming in until there's a sufficient amount or to make sure the analysis itself is being done correctly. However, at either the planned analyses or from a safety perspective or a visit perspective, then those things, if they're meeting criteria for reconsenting, then should be updated in a reconsent process along the way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Dr. Brander. I believe we had another question. Lynn, did you have something you wanted to ask? If not, no worries. Okay. If so, I believe you're muted. If not, that's just fine. All right. Oh, don't want to mute myself. I apologize. Okay. So I do have one question a patient submitted before Dr. Brander. They weren't able to be here. But just wanted to ask you that here, if that's all right.
Of course.
Okay, so they stated, I am interested as I go through clinicaltrials.gov, I feel overwhelmed. I don't have clinical trials near me that are like facilities near them. And so they are wondering if they travel long distance, A couple things. So let's see. So a couple things they stated were, if the costs are covered inside of the trial, that's included inside of just like listed on the trials page, or would they need to reach out to the contact information and the individual whose contact information is listed on clinicaltrials.gov to get more insight about if things are reimbursed, if they do decide to travel long distance to receive that treatment?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are cases where there can be, to help support other expenses incurred while participating, but that can sometimes be dependent on the distance, the type of trial, and all of those things also have to be approved along with the study by the individual institution to make sure, again, coming from a place of protecting patients' rights, meaning it has to be, done so in a safe way and in a way that isn't, is considered fair and reasonable, so that patients' consent and participating is, felt voluntary and not felt dependent or on those needs. So it has to be the bottom line is approved by the institution. The institution may have its own policies for that. So I think at the end of the day, the contact there is a good, usually a good initial resource, because as best as clinicaltrials.gov tries to stay up to date, sometimes trials may have just wrapped up and aren't, enrolling or including patients, or even in understanding general things like sometimes the title is not clear and you find out, oh, this is only for patients that have had these 2 other treatments. So both for those specific questions, but also just understanding if that trial is some path to go down, I think reaching out to the contact is a good place, as well as some of the other resources I mentioned with LLS and others that try to help patients navigate trial options for just that reason of not going down a path of things that may not apply to you individually.
That is good to know. Thank you for answering that. Okay, we have one question in the chat, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. But Kat is asking, if I have a health emergency during or after a trial that could be related to the study treatment, who will cover the cost of that health emergency? And then also, will I be able to stay on the trial?
So as part of the consent or participating in a trial, there should be contact information, as well as information about what to do if you experience a health emergency. The short and the long answer is it would be hard outside of an individual patient's experience to know, for example, if it's a side effect that can happen with any treatment, how that would be managed or covered. But all consent should include information about who to contact in the case of an emergency. And in the part of if you can stay on the clinical trial treatment, again, that would depend on the likelihood that the emergency was related, as well as any protocol specific information. It may be that the treatment itself has to be held, but that can be resumed, or in some cases, if it's a severe related side effect, it may be a reason that patients have to stop treatment. And of course, outside of the individual protocol, your oncologist or treating physician may say in some cases, well, even if the protocol says at some point you can resume, it just may not be felt to be in your best interest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I know that we're almost over time. Dr. Brander, are you okay to stay on for a few more minutes for this last question here?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. So Lynn is wondering, are there any encouraging trials for people who have deletion 17p? It seems like a lot of trials exclude those folks.
Yeah, so great question. I would say a lot of, well, let me start with the second part, the exclusion of patients with deletion 17p. At least to my knowledge, most of the trials that exclude patients with deletion 17p in their CLL are any trials that may directly include chemo or randomize to something involving chemotherapy. And in that case, it's really for protection of patients that have that deletion not being assigned to chemotherapy, which doesn't work very well at all in deletion of 17p. So some trials that exclude that, in my mind, do so out of safety. In terms of encouraging trials, going down that line, I would say, any of the novel therapeutics, either by themselves or in combination, like the BTK and BCL2 inhibitors, should work independently of that deletion. So there are trials looking at that, those combinations. In the case of, for example, the CAR-T or the other cellular therapy trials, they should not exclude patients, but they're for patients that have relapsed or refractory CLL. Right now, as a first treatment or relapse refractory, I think those novel combinations, I would say, would be the most encouraging, but I think all of the non-chemotherapy are encouraging. So it would depend if this is for a first treatment or in the relapse refractory setting. Also mention one thing we didn't talk about here is what's called early intervention clinical trials with drugs. So right now for CLL and SLL, there's a cooperative group trial called the EVOLVE study. It's for patients who have never had treatment for their CLL, are within 18 months of diagnosis, but otherwise have high risk features such that this total score system we call the CLL IPI score, which having deletion 17p already puts in a higher risk category. That trial is, I think, promising and looking at early intervention potential for patients who otherwise don't meet classical treatment options.
Thank you, Dr. Brander. And thank you, Lynn, for that question. That's good to know. I know patients with deletion 17p, it can often seem discouraging, but thank you, Dr. Brander, for letting us know about the novel combinations. And definitely there is a lot of hope out there. More so than it used to be with just chemotherapy. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will wrap up here. Hope everyone can see that okay. All right. So that is all the time that we have for the discussion today. And thank you so much, Dr. Brander, for that very informative presentation and for your support for the CLL patient community. One thing I did want to let everyone know about is a free resource available to you called HealthTree Care Hub. So HealthTree Care Hub allows you the ability to securely connect your medical records. You can track your CLL labs in one place, accelerate CLL research by participating in surveys, find clinical trials, and side effect solutions. We invite you to access your free HealthTree Care Hub account by visiting the link at the bottom of this slide. And then I'd also like to mention when our next CLL webinars will take place. Tomorrow, we will be learning about how to track your CLL labs in HealthTree Care Hub. On May 13th, we'll hear from Dr. Adam Kate about bispecific antibody use in CLL. On May 30th, oncology registered dietitian Joan Elizondo will discuss dietary guidelines for cancer prevention after treatment. And then on June 26th, Dr. Carrie Rogers will be discussing relapse refractory CLL treatment options. So to register for one or more of these upcoming events, please visit the link at the bottom of the slide. Thank you again for our HealthTree Community for CLL sponsors, without whom this event would not be possible, AbbVie and Genentech. And thank you everyone for helping us build a strong HealthTree community for CLL. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope to see all of you again soon, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about HealthTree or any upcoming events. Thank you so much.